Great. Steven Fitzgerald from Habanero Consulting Group, based in Vancouver, office in Calgary and Toronto, and I'm one of the founders and president here.
And at what point did you think of yourself in that role of leadership that give you the confidence to say, I'm going to create a company? Or did that happen before you started?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I wish there was a heroic story for that, but there isn't. I've always been fascinated by where design and technology come together, this kind of confluence of these two parts of my personality. And I used to be an engineer. I consider myself a recovering engineer because you never quite get it out of your system. I had a job as an engineer, and a fellow I worked with, he was really strong in the technology part. So we started collaborating on projects, moonlighting for 3 or 4 years, getting things here and there. And this is sort of the birth of the internet, that era when we were going from CD-ROMs, desktop publishing into CD-ROMs, into web browsers, and so we started getting a few little projects here and there, and some of them started getting pretty serious. So at one point, we decided we're going to just hang a shingle and quit our day jobs as engineers, which felt like a kind of a crazy thing to do. I remember I was making $54,000 a year then. I thought, I'll give myself 3 years to get back to that salary. I was very ambitious. So we hung a shingle, and we thought we were going to be independent consultants, and we were going out convincing, having conversations like, there's this thing called the internet, and you can build websites, and you can connect with your customers that way. So we were starting to be a little bit successful enough to the point where we needed to get some help from other people. And there was this moment of reckoning where we realized, okay, well, we can't do this alone. We need other people. And there's a lot going on in our lives with new families and things like that for both of us. So we had to get serious about why we're doing this, what's our sense of purpose around this, how do our values come into play, are we building an organization, what's that like? But we didn't go into this thinking about that. In fact, I have no entrepreneurial background or education or training, or my dad wasn't an entrepreneur, nor was my mom, and if I had any idea about how little I knew about building a business, I never would have had the guts to wander into this in the first place.
So do you think of yourself as a planner, or did this literally happen to you?
This happened. I opened myself up at this point in my life to pursue something I was deeply passionate about. So this is the result of a movement that was going against my sort of planning-oriented self that had got me to where I was before this. Because
as an engineer, you would think of yourself as a planner.
I think so. And every single personality testing and profiling I've ever done says I should be an engineer. I ended up there. I think I just really like math. This was actually something different. Going into this was submitting to passion against logic and plan, I think.
So passion gets you somewhere, and then the reality of running a business kicks in. How do you deal with that, both back then and now?
Yeah, I had some very deep concerns in early days about pursuing this path because of a bit of an obsessive personality, and I knew that I was lowering myself down into a hole of something that I may never want to crawl out of, and I was conscious of the negative impacts of that. So I think a lot about, we used to think about the concept of work-life balance. I hate that term. It feels like a zero-sum game. We've evolved to thinking about the term. We have a value based on harmony, and the idea is that, as we see it, that if you create an environment where you can experience passion in the different parts of your life that really matter, and it's very temporal and it's very specific. But for me, it's riding my bike, it's Habanero, it's my kids and my family and my community. If I can deeply engage in those things and experience passion in them, I take energy from that and I put it into the other one. So, the concept of work-life balance makes me feel like, well, I'm going to be a deadbeat dad this month and work really hard at work, be an awesome, really successful businessman, and then I'm going to kind of slough off at work and not really show up and be a great dad next month. That's not the way I see it. When I've had a great night with the kids, I show up at work different the next day. When I have a really good ride into work and or a great ride on the weekend, like it helps me be a better dad, it helps me be a better partner to my wife, it helps me be better at Habanero, and that passion, I think, fuels the other thing. So I think it's the opposite of a zero-sum game, and that's sort of my whole philosophy around it, and that's one of our values at Habanero. We're trying to build an organization where that respects that dynamic in people's lives, and allows them to create the professional aspect of the professional sphere of that harmony in a way that respects other things that are happening in their lives.
So let's talk a little bit more about those values. How did you know that those were the right values for the company? And how did you then maybe communicate that to the team?
Yeah, so we took a pretty classic route early on and did a bunch of thinking and got some help here and there, and articulated a larger group of guiding principles and boiled them down, and we've worked on refining how we talk about them, how we think about them quite a bit, but they're largely the same ideas that we started with 19 years ago. But the concepts of them are static, but how they apply themselves and how it's manifested in the organization is very dynamic. So they're just, I find my learning around this is there has to be a constant dialogue around purpose and values. Why do we exist, and what are the kind of guidelines that we operate within to make sense of it on an ongoing basis. So your question was, how do we come up with them, and how do we communicate them? I think that it's tempting to say we came up with them because we had a workshop and we had these ideas, but really they're ideas that have just grown and evolved, and paying enough constant attention to them has developed them into the more mature ideas that they are now, and they'll keep continuing in the future. So it's a continuum of development rather than one activity. And the other thing is to the communication of it has to be part, I think it has to be part of, or for us it's been more successful when it's been part of a communication that everyone owns in the organization. So there's a sense of autonomy and control everyone should have over their version and interpretation of the values, and I want to have conversations about that with people. And I feel my job in the company, one of my key jobs is to observe what's going on and help people understand and make sense of it in terms of our purpose and our values. Like, we made this decision, or this happened, or there's this consequence. Like, well, let's talk about that in the context of our purpose and our values, and that's part of the ongoing communication to really help people make sense of it.
So how does that then influence bringing new people into the company? Because I'm certain that as you've grown, that's been a factor, right?
Yeah, so our kind of driving design principle behind hiring is to sort of know your culture and then hire for your culture. And your purpose and your values are boiled right into what your culture is. And your culture is really those ideas and other ones coming to life in this ongoing sort of way. And I find, as simple as that and catchy as that sounds, know your culture and hire to it, like it's really hard to hire to a culture, and it's really hard to set up measurable ways of interacting with someone and getting a real sense of whether or not they fit that culture. But as hard as that is, it's way harder for organizations to actually know what their culture is. And the tendency is to say, wow, we're a work hard, play hard kind of culture, or we're just kind of throwing out the slogans that we all like to think about work, but to really find tenets of your culture that are meaningful. For example, this isn't good or bad, but we're a highly collaborative culture, and we know that smart people, capable people that are very experienced, they don't survive in Habanero unless they're collaborative as well. So that's an aspect of our culture that we can take into a hiring process, a candidate assessment process, and measure. And we invest really heavily. For every single person that we hire, we've had on average between 18 and say 23 or 24 hours of our time in interviews with that person. So we spend a little bit of time on understanding the skills and the fit for the role. We spend a whole bunch of time on understanding the personality fit and the fit for our culture. And we have some components of that, like being collaborative, that we're sort of dialed, and we have a series of ways to test and understand that. And then there's a bunch of other things that are just like what does your gut say about this person? How is it going to fit in?
Mhm.
And so there's a mix of science and art in our hiring process. And at this point, my answer, I can't even remember what your question was anymore. So.
You answered the question. It's all good. As you think about yourself as objectively as can you think about a word or a sentence or a phrase that would describe your leadership style?
Patient.
Patient. Do you think others would agree with that?
I'm curious. I don't know.
Interesting. Why do you think patience works for you?
I've realized over time that I'm very oriented around thinking about things in the long term, and we have always thought about Habanero as an organization that we didn't want to create a lifestyle organization. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to portray that as a negative thing, but we feel that there's a change to be made in the world that Habanero can play an important role in, but it's not going to happen in 10 or 20 years. It's going to happen in the longer term. And unfortunately, I won't be suitable for this role for that period of time. And there's going to be a lot of turnover and change and evolution and growth. So we need to build an organization that will last a really long time. So we really put a lot of thought into organizational sustainability, and I always think about you're building an edifice for people to come and sort of practice in your culture and share your ideas, and there's another metaphor or example where they would build these